I am physically and mentally prepared for this. There was once a guy called James. He lived in Jerusalem with his family. But this wasn't any normal family, because James was the biological brother of Jesus. But Jesus wasn't with his family, because he was building a ministry and was choosing people to become his disciples. Unfortunately for Jesus, his ministry was spreading bad news to the people around him, including Jerusalem, and eventually reaching his own parents. So once Jesus entered Jerusalem, countless people were surrounding him, not because he was the new king, but because teachers of the law were stating that he was cursed by the prince of evil. But once James caught hold of this news, they thought Jesus was out of his mind. So Jesus replied to the teachers of the law with parables. Mark 3:23-29 says, "How can Satan drive out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. If a house is divided against itself, that house cannot stand. And if Satan opposes himself and is divided, he cannot stand. His end has come. In fact, no one can enter a strong man's house without first tying him up. Then he can plunder the strong man's house. I truly tell you, people can be forgiven all their sins and every slander they utter. But whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit will never be forgiven. They are guilty of an eternal sin." James's family sent a messenger to tell Jesus that his family was looking for him. But how Jesus answered was absolutely astounding. Mark 3:34-35 says, "Then he looked at those seated in a circle around him and said, 'Here are my mother and brothers. Whoever does God's will is my brother and sister and mother.'" Eventually, Jesus went back to his hometown of Nazareth with his disciples and preached in the synagogues during the Sabbath. Everyone was amazed and questioned him, "Where did this man get his things? And what are these miracles he's performing?" They were offended by how much wisdom he had. Jesus was surprised at how little faith they had in him. James was one of the people who listened, and he lacked in faith in Jesus until Jesus took everyone's sins. In 1 Corinthians 15:3-9, James talks about how he accepted Jesus as his Messiah, thus converting him. He talked about how Jesus returned from the dead and how he talked to the disciples and the 500 brothers and sisters of Christ. Once James believed in Jesus, he became a servant of his own brother and became one of Jesus' 12 disciples. He was like the shadow of Jesus, following him through his journey. Though, once Jesus was baptized and returned to his homeland of heaven, James was left with nothing to do until Peter spoke up. Peter and the disciples agreed to give his leadership of his early church to James, which he happily agreed to take. But the issue with James is that he is on the more Jewish side of Christianity, while the people on his early church were Gentiles and non-Christian. So James created ground rules for the church for others to follow, like no blood sacrifices. He was also allowed to enter the temple, where he occasionally went in alone and asked for forgiveness of the people, which is why he's also known as James the Just. Now it's time to talk about his death. James was seized by an angry mob of Jews and was told to tell his faith. So James created a speech about Jesus, which actually caught a few of them to believe in him. But of course, that made the rest of them angry. So he was ordered to be thrown off the top of the temple. Yet, he survived the fall. Once the crowd had realized he wasn't dead, they began to stone James. Then one of them came up with a club and killed him. His death was either in 62 or 67 AD. People built a statue where he died, as well where his body was buried. It's interesting how James started as a non-believer of Jesus, to be slain because he had so much faith in Jesus. His conversion didn't only change his thoughts, but it changed what he's done for everyone, and how he followed Jesus. Not only in his biological brother sort of way, but as a servant of him.